What is the philosophical meaning of death? Have you ever wondered what happens after we die? Is death the end or just another beginning? Since the dawn of civilization, the greatest minds in history have tried to answer this question. Today, we dive deep into the philosophies of 7 legendary thinkers: Socrates, Epicurus, the Stoics, Heidegger, Sartre, Camus, and Schopenhauer, to understand what death truly means. So, sit back, open your mind, and let's explore the great mystery of existence. Part 1. Socrates, Death as a Transition. Let's begin with Socrates, the father of Western philosophy. As he faced his execution in 399 BCE, he remained calm. In Plato's Phaedo, Socrates tells his followers that death is nothing to fear. Why? Because either one of two things happens. Death is a peaceful sleep, a dreamless state where we feel nothing. If that's the case, then why should we be afraid? Or, death is a transition. Our soul moves on to another reality where we can continue to learn and explore. For Socrates, the philosopher's job is to prepare for death by seeking wisdom and truth. If we have lived a virtuous life, there is nothing to regret when death arrives. Part 2. Epicurus, Death is Nothing to Fear. A few centuries later, Epicurus took a radically different approach. He argued that death is simply the end of consciousness. His famous quote, "When we exist, death is not. When death exists, we are not." In other words, if we don't experience death, then why should we fear it? Fear of death, according to Epicurus, is irrational. Instead, we should focus on living a life full of simple pleasures and deep friendships. Death is nothingness, and nothingness cannot harm us. Part 3. The Stoics, Acceptance of Death. The Stoics, such as Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, believed that death is simply part of the natural order. To resist it is to resist nature itself. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." What he meant was that we make death scarier than it actually is. Instead of fearing it, we should accept it, just as we accept the sun rising and setting. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and philosopher, reminded himself daily, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." For the Stoics, death is not an enemy. It's a reminder to live virtuously and focus on what truly matters. Part 4. Heidegger, Death Gives Life Meaning. Fast forward to the 20th century and we meet Martin Heidegger. He introduced a new idea. We are all beings toward death. According to Heidegger, humans are unique because we are aware of our own mortality. Instead of running from this knowledge, we should embrace it. Death, he argued, is what gives our lives urgency and meaning. Knowing that time is limited forces us to live authentically, to take responsibility for our choices. So, the question is, are you truly living or just waiting to die? Part 5. Sartre, Death is Absurd. Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, saw death as a meaningless, absurd event. It cuts our lives short with no explanation, no reason. For Sartre, death is frustrating. Why? Because everything we've built, our dreams, our relationships, our ambitions, vanishes the moment we die. There is no afterlife, no greater purpose. But instead of despair, Sartre saw this as liberation. If life has no pre-assigned meaning, then we must create our own. We define ourselves by our actions, knowing that one day everything will end. Part 6. Camus, Rebel Against the Void. Albert Camus, another existentialist, took Sartre's ideas a step further. He believed that life is absurd, it has no inherent meaning. We search for purpose in a universe that is silent. So, what should we do? Should we give in to despair? Camus said, "We must rebel against the absurd. We must live as if life has meaning, even when we know it doesn't." His famous example is Sisyphus, the Greek mythological figure condemned to push a boulder up a hill for eternity. Camus' conclusion? We must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why? Because even in a meaningless world, we can still find joy, love, and personal freedom. Part 7. Schopenhauer, Death is Relief. Finally, we turn to Arthur Schopenhauer, the ultimate pessimist. He believed that life is full of suffering. Our desires keep us trapped in an endless cycle of pain and frustration. But what is death? A release. Schopenhauer saw death not as a tragedy, but as a relief from the endless striving of existence. He compared life to a burning flame. When the flame is extinguished, so is suffering. While this may sound bleak, Schopenhauer's philosophy has an interesting takeaway. By letting go of attachment and embracing stillness, we can find peace even before death. So, what does death mean? The answer depends on who you ask. Socrates saw it as a transition. Epicurus dismissed it as irrelevant. The Stoics taught us to accept it. Heidegger believed it gives life urgency. Sartre saw it as absurd, yet freeing. Camus urged us to rebel against it, and Schopenhauer viewed it as relief. Perhaps the real question is not what happens when we die, but rather, how should we live knowing that we will? So tell me, what do you think death means?